I'm Sarina Fazan, taking a risk, making a difference, and changing the course of your life. Remarkable stories from people defying the odds. You're listening to On the Record. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the Record. And I'm so excited. It is my honor and privilege, actually, to have Dr. Susan Mcmanus join me on this podcast. She is internationally known as a political analyst. Dr. Mcmanus, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, I want you to take a few minutes and tell everybody about you. And please don't leave out anything. Modesty aside, tell us everything.
Well, I'm the daughter of citrus growers, and my grandfather was one of the first to live in Lutz, Florida, and he came as an immigrant from Germany and started raising oranges, and the rest is history. I was born and raised in Pasco County and went to Florida State and the University of Michigan and back to FSU, and I've taught at the University of Houston and Cleveland State University, and my last 30 years were at the University of South Florida. So I'm a farm girl, and I'm a native Floridian. And you don't find too many people like that these days that are in politics.
Well, you have weighed in on, nationally and internationally on the cases or the elections, I should say, that we have seen here in the U.S.
Absolutely. I've been following politics since I was a child. I grew up in a divided household. So I grew up with a lot of political dialogue and discussion and excitement about diversity of opinion. My father was one party, my mother another, and my extended family to this day, I have everything from a railroad union leader uncle to a cousin that's a Baptist minister and everything in between.
Wow.
I myself am no party affiliation, and I really, as a professor, was intently focused on not showing bias in the classroom. I never wanted to discourage someone from being an activist and being engaged in their communities regardless of their politics.
Well, I really wanted to establish who you are so we can talk about this election coming up. We have not seen anything like this in years with the coronavirus crisis affecting the election, right, Dr. McManus?
This is the most interesting, from a political analyst and political science perspective, election we've had in a long time. It's also the most challenging for people who are offering themselves up for public office, because not only COVID-19, but you have an economic crisis and you have a lot of concerns about racial issues. All three in and of themselves, if they were separate, would be dominant. But when you have all three of them existing at the same time and all affecting the other, it is very difficult for a candidate, particularly somebody running for a local office, to get their message across to the public. Everything is being dominated by presidential politics.
So I want to talk about that, but and there's so much to talk about. Speaking of local candidates, just recently on the podcast, we had John Schiaffino on, who is running for Circuit Court Judge Group 9. We also had Jen McDonald on, who's running for Hillsborough County Commission, District 1. I know you specifically cannot talk about those races, or the candidates, I should say, but when you were talking about local candidates having a hard time, tell us more about that.
First of all, it's very difficult for local candidates to campaign in a way that's always been most successful, which is going door to door, knocking on people's doors. Or they also can't get in big groups. Campaigns in the past, or candidates would be able to go to a Rotary Club or a League of Women Voters or a community forum of some sort. But now it's hard to reach a lot of people at the same time. So you're very dependent upon other platforms to get your message out. And for the judicial candidates, they have an even bigger problem in that most people who are registered as no party affiliation don't realize that they can actually vote for judicial candidates. Our primaries for judicial candidates are, well, first of all, judicial races are nonpartisan, and yet we hold the primary for them at the same time that we hold party primaries, and it's very confusing to people that are NPAs. They don't realize they can vote. So they have another hurdle to jump over.
And isn't it also that they
can... a party affiliation, yeah.
And they can't even talk specifically to certain issues either. Could you explain that to people, why judicial candidates even are limited in what they can say?
Very limited, because when you think about it, if you've been accused of a crime, would you want to have to appear before a judge who's made specific statements about how they feel about ruling on certain cases? You want, if you're going into their judicial system, you want the feeling that the courtroom is going to be, and the judge is going to be impartial and listen to the evidence presented without already having their minds made up or a certain direction. So objectivity and impartiality are two characteristics that people look for in a judge. At the same time, a voter who is looking at a list of 3 or 4 or 5 candidates for a judicial position are scratching their heads, how do I know who to vote for? It's very difficult.
And especially during this time, I mean, I know for me, when you actually see the candidate and you get to hear them or see them face to face, you might have a gut instinct about them or a feeling, but now they can't do that at all, which adds the extra layer. And I'm not even talking about with any candidate.
Right. And now you're pretty much limited to virtual campaigning. You see some innovative things taking place, people having virtual town hall meetings. They'll call somebody on the phone or send a blast out saying, tune in here, we're going to have this kind of session. You do see some civic groups organizing these forums where the candidates can be on the stage, social distance, and someone can tune in. Some other innovative things are people are having themed events. Recently, there was a tea sponsored by the Florida Commission on the Status of Women, where you just signed in. You could drink tea in your home or whatever, but it was a way to grab women's attention. Men could listen to, of course, about the women's suffrage movement and what that was doing in the 19th Amendment passage, which, of course, the 100th anniversary is this year. Other things people are doing are setting up Zoom interviews where you're interviewed, if you're a candidate, by a celebrity that will draw in people.
Wow, okay, so that's interesting.
Somebody's having to be very creative in how they reach people. But at the same time, people are many voters are so downtrodden by the health issue, the COVID issue, and their economic status that it's really hard to get them to spend the time to tune in to some of these virtual events, which on the face of it are very interesting and creative.
I want to get back to that point, but speaking of tuning in and social media, do you feel right now more than ever that social media needs to be utilized?
It has to be, because you can't do door to door, which does save money because grassroots campaigning can be expensive, and so too can big rallies. Both of the parties save themselves a ton of money by not having their big national conventions. On the other hand, they're going to have to rely on social media and streaming and so forth to get people to take a look at their gathering or their candidate's acceptance speech. So you have trade-offs, but at the local level, you still have television and radio and podcasts and social media. But you have to be careful about social media. There's a lot of generational differences. Mm-hmm. And let me just take as an example.
Yes, please. I was going to say, please talk about that.
Texting does not work with younger voters. They are very irritated by texting, particularly from somebody telling them they haven't registered or whatever, or in their face. A lot of younger people regard texting as their sort of private domain for their social life.
Interesting.
So when politicians intrude on it, they click out right away and they're alienated by it. So that's a good example of the generational difference. On the other hand, texting, we know from the 2018 election, can be a little bit problematic with older voters who are just now getting used to social media, mainly to talk to their grandchildren and so forth. But when someone texts and say, you haven't voted yet, they're wondering, so somebody's following me around? There's a little security concern there.
Right.
So there's no means of campaigning that's 100% great for everybody. One size does not fit all in campaigning. And it's particularly the case in this day and age that you see sharp generational differences in what they regard as something they're interested in versus older voters who may not find Instagram or any of those, Snapchat, of any interest, or they don't know how to use it. So I'm making some generalizations there. There are obviously some elders who are really good at all of that, but for the most part, many older people are not knowledgeable about some of these newer forms of social media.
And it's interesting, too, because some of the candidates also have to learn social media. I was talking to John Schifino. He's 54 years old. He has a daughter. He has a son and a daughter, 18 and 20 years old. And, the kids, of course, are more well-versed. My own 13-year-old knows much more about social media than I do. But I think that adds another layer for these candidates on what they have to learn in how to reach people. Right, Dr. McManus?
Absolutely. And we are in an era of what we call micro-targeting because there's so much diversity within the electorate itself. For example, even within the Democratic Party, you have, different kinds of caucuses. You have the Women's Caucus, you have the LGBTQ caucus, you have the Veterans Caucus, and so on and so forth. You can't reach each of those groups with the same message or even the same means of communicating with them, which is why we say that the toughest part of being a campaign manager or a candidate is figuring out precisely how to reach those narrow slices of an electorate. But in a state like ours, where candidates win statewide races with less than a 1% margin of victory, if you don't micro-target and really figure out effective ways of communicating your message to these various slices that differ by age, generation, religion, party, gender, you may very well lose a race.
Well, okay, speaking of our state, and again, I want to go to what you mentioned as well. Now that we're seeing a spike in coronavirus cases, I know some candidates were maybe thinking about going door to door, maybe. Now, though, with the spike, there's so much fear. That has to play in as well.
Fear does play into it. That's exactly, people are very hesitant to open the door to someone they don't know, who may not have a mask on or should have a mask on, but doesn't, or is getting too close. The same thing that people are worried about going to a large gathering, a meeting of some sort, even of a club that they've belonged to for years, or even a church session. People just are very, very nervous. Not all, but particularly older people, nervous about mingling with people, since Florida is one of the states that has the highest incidence of COVID-19 at the moment.
And that's what I was going to ask you. And it's more challenging here, right, Doctor, because of the spike in the cases.
Definitely. And the more negative news people hear, the more they sort of retrench and spend less time with other people. So there's not a lot of exchange of different ideas. People stick to close-knit friends and family more. And I think one of the big challenges that a lot of candidates are going to have this fall is really energizing and mobilizing and turning out college students, many of whom will be taking all their classes online. And so it is the case that traditionally colleges have really been the energy center for communal and collective action and really exciting young people about voting. But there's a huge question mark about how to reach that group who may not be on campus to the degree that they will not be on campus to the degree that they were. There's so many uncertainties. I say this is the hardest time period in which to run for office, and also the toughest time for campaign managers and strategists to figure out how to reach all these very narrow slices of the American electorate.
And what about the whole financial aspect? We're seeing so many unemployed people. So the pressure of candidates or anybody asking for money in the first place, I think, can be hard, difficult. But now, what about that aspect, the financial aspect of it all?
Huge, especially for local candidates. presidential candidates can tap into networks that someone running for a county commissioner, a judicial post, or a school board position, they simply can't tap into those kind of networks. And yet it takes money to get your name out there. Fortunately, at the moment, you can get your name out there still with some traditional mechanisms like signs, but that doesn't really grab everybody's attention either, because a lot of people are staying home.
I was going to ask you that question.
Right.
Can signs play a greater role at this time than you touched upon that point? A lot of people aren't even leaving their houses.
Right, exactly. Or you can still, if you have a good network, engage people to call their friends. It's still very effective for neighbors to neighbors and friends to friends to get a message across. Radio is inexpensive. Social media, same. TV is more expensive, but it's the quickest way to get your name recognition up there. And a lot of people just aren't even aware of the fact that we have an August 18th election here in our state. And yet it's so critical, because we elect, the August 18th primary is so important, because some of the offices that are at stake here are things that people hold near and dear, and they're things that affect them locally, like school boards and the court system and the county commission. All of those and legislators are offices that more directly affect the average voter day to day than even the presidential election does. And yet so many people are unaware that August 18th is a big day. And I might add, it's the 100th celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote.
Wow, isn't that something? Gosh, that is definitely worth celebrating for sure. I mean, that's huge. So it's hard enough, as you talked about, to get people to the polls in the first place. This year, more challenges.
Right. This is the toughest time for candidates to campaign that I've seen in a very, very long time, because you have 3 or 4 crises that are impacting someone simultaneously, COVID-19 being number one, but the economy, people's economic circumstance. You have the whole protest and concern about social and racial equity. And then you also now have big decisions about what to do if you have children in terms of sending them back to school or not. These are all very pressing problems that can easily distract a voter from trying to find out about candidates that they may know nothing about, or even to think about going to vote in a primary election. This is the toughest time we've ever seen for a candidate to really sell themselves to voters.
Is it even fair to have an election at all? I know that's, I just have to ask you that question, because people have asked me that question.
Of course it is. We have to rule by law. We set these dates. Come what, come not, then we have to have an election. Otherwise, you can see a circumstance would emerge of where things are so unpredictable that you could have a case where maybe we didn't have elections for a long period of time, and that wouldn't be right either.
No, that would actually be awful, right? So I would imagine, especially now, incumbents would be at a huge advantage because their name is already out there.
That is the case. And that's why it's very difficult for a first timer, unless they're well known, to compete with an incumbent, because a first time candidate, as we've said before, has a lot of difficulty in raising money, and money is necessary to be able to raise your name identification up so that the average person knows who you are. It costs a lot of money.
So talk to us, Dr. McManus, about voting specifically here in our state. I know it has been hard to get people to the polls, and also been hard to have people mail in ballots. But specifically at this time, do you think it's going to be even more challenging? I would imagine so, because clearly people are afraid of leaving their home. I do even have people that are afraid of checking their mail. Like, they want to wipe down their mail even before they touch the mail.
Well, the good news is that Florida has three ways of voting. One, obviously, is to ask for a vote by mail ballot. Another is to do early voting in person. And the third way would be election day. And I recently saw a survey where they asked Floridians what they would prefer. And it's a pretty even mix, actually.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting to me as well. But for different reasons, people choose a different mechanism. Some people really enjoy the excitement of going to the polling place on election day where all the people are out there with the signs and whatever, and there's an energy. Others like the convenience of early voting, but in person, because they feel like, well, maybe they're a little bit hesitant about vote by mail. Maybe it's not going to get to the supervisor in time or whatever. So that's an option, or if somebody's out of town or whatever. And then vote by mail is very popular, particularly with older and younger voters who have different kinds of schedules. For an older person, not having to go to a polling place where there might be obstacles, or allowing them to stay at home where they can put the materials side by side and study the candidates more. And for a younger person whose schedules are truly erratic, the vote by mail is an alternative, even though we have seen a national study of late which shows that a large percentage of younger people don't understand or even know about how to register online or how to vote via mail.
Can you
So
share?
both
Can you
parties will
share
have
that
to-
information though with us? Can you share it quickly? Because I know. I mean, I've been asked that very same question.
But if you can register online, and you can absolutely call into a supervisor's office as well and ask for them to mail you a vote by mail ballot, and they send you the instructions. As long as you're registered, you can easily get that. It's easy to move your registration from one place to another. A simple call to a supervisor of elections office or going online and then contacting. But many people just don't realize that. They think, I can't tell you the number of my USF students who would tell me, I asked them if they voted in an election. Well, Doc, I feel really bad, but I didn't. I would have had to drive to Palm Beach. And I said, why? Oh, I didn't know you could do that. So I think now we have clear enough evidence of the problems with younger people not knowing about voting method alternatives that both political parties this time out are working really, really hard to educate younger voters about these options.
Education can definitely be key, especially at this time. So when we talked about people actually going to the polls and actually voting, do you think we are going to see, though, crowds of people out there holding signs? I mean, I'm curious to see as, we come up on the date, are there even going to be people out there holding signs?
Well, I don't know how many, and now they've increased the distance from the polling location that you can actually do that. Because in 2018, Florida rewrote a lot of its election code, and one of the elements that they did add was increasing the distance between the actual polling location and when people could engage voters, because we had a pretty significant incidence of people complaining that they were being badgered and they feared, and some people left the polling place without voting because they felt intimidated. So that new law was designed to keep that from happening, but at the same time, it might depress the energy level that might have come from the signs being a little bit closer. But
it'll be interesting to see.
Pluses and minuses and everything.
Do you feel that the supervisor of elections offices throughout the state of Florida are adequately equipped to handle the election this year?
I think we have one of the best election systems in the entire country. Our supervisors of elections are miles ahead of supervisors in a lot of other states, even though they may get some criticism. I don't know of one of them that doesn't want people to vote. After all, they're elected positions. Mm-hmm. And so why would they not want people to vote? So they're reaching out as best they can. The concern that some have is, will they have enough of the sanitizer and all of that, which right now, Craig Latimer and other supervisors in this area have made it very clear that they're well equipped with that and they're very aware of it. So I think that for people who worry about our supervisors being ready, Florida's much ahead of most other states. we don't want a repeat of the 2000 election in Florida.
No, we don't. And I think that we are way ahead because of all these experiences that we have had. So, Doctor, because I would like to talk to you again as we get closer to the national, election, but keeping August 18th in mind, what is the best advice that you would have for candidates at this point? Just keep on plugging away with those phone calls and getting their signs out there?
And making sure that people know who they are and know who people are that are likely to vote. You can easily get that from the supervisor's office. You can get the voting records of people and see who would be really very high likelihood turnout voters. And that's kind of the group that you need to focus on. But all it takes sometimes is a few people to push your vote in the right direction. So it's friends and neighbors, and get as much attention as you can. A lot of people don't realize the value of radio, and a lot of these shows would like to have candidates come on and talk. The closer you get to an election, podcasts.
Take advantage of it.
Mailers are good for older voters. They will look at the mailers. Younger people, not so much. You just have to be creative, and it's tough.
What is your gut instinct on turnout?
I'm suspecting it's not going to be terrific August 18th. A greater likelihood that you might have a high turnout in the presidential. But the timing of Florida's primary, it's a late primary. Some states had their primaries in the spring. Of course, that would have been right in the middle of COVID as well. But you see, we're kind of late, and it's the end of the summer and all these other factors going on. COVID,
protests,
economy, protests,
getting
and
kids
the
back
school
into school
issue are just big issues that take away people's interest in an August 18th election.
I think people
and that's why I feel very sorry for the candidates that are running right now. But I tell you, in general, and then I'll stop with this, the group that has the most challenging job this entire election season are the supervisor of elections, because everybody expects a perfect election.
Right.
But in reality, equipment can break down and people can make mistakes. But I want people to really appreciate the fact that there isn't any supervisor that doesn't want people to vote.
And I think we all have to remember, too, I mean, we fought so hard for the right to vote. And you pointed out the anniversary as well for women, that especially at this time when there is so much at stake for all of us, that we need to get out there and vote. So Dr. McManus, as always, it was such an honor and privilege to have you on the podcast. Do you have any closing remarks?
I just hope that people vote and realize what a precious thing it is. So many people in the world don't have this opportunity to select their governing bodies, and we do.
Thank you so much, Dr. McManus, and I look forward to talking to you again as we get even closer to the national elections. Thank you so much again, and thank you for listening to On the Record. You can find me on every social media platform out there, and I love hearing from you, so please give me feedback. Thanks for watching and listening.